Police are investigating whether UKIP Euro candidate Carl Benjamin might have committed a crime when he stated he might rape Labour MP Jess Phillips. I think it's shocking that politics has been reduced to such vile and abusive personal attacks, especially from a twat-faced, beardy, tiny-cocked tosser like him.
You know how hipsters sort of get rubbed the wrong way when they see wider society participating in something that they've been doing for ages, just because now it's mainstream? Well, that's how I felt when I started seeing people all across the UK hating Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad. By the way, I was going to call him Carl Benjamin in this video because I'm primarily responding to him as a politician, not as a YouTuber. But I kept naturally slipping into calling him Sargon as I was writing this, so I've kept it that way. And besides, I don't really have a problem with using YouTube pseudonyms. Honestly, I find the whole Carl of Swindon thing kind of, Like, maybe Sargon of Akkad is a kind of pretentious name, but so is King Arpharazon, so glass houses and all that. I will say though, that while looking for clips on YouTube, I came across this comment. "He lives in Swindon," followed by condescending laughter from people who supposedly view all people as equal no matter where they come from. Now, I realise that Swindon has a bad reputation, but I'm pretty sure the joke isn't, haha, Carl Benjamin lives in Swindon, but rather the hilarious contrast between being called Sargon of Akkad, hearkening to one of the greatest rulers of one of the greatest empires of the ancient Near East, and living in Swindon. This interpretation seems especially likely from the context where Jess Phillips clearly prefaced her comment about him being from Swindon by making reference to his username.
Were made by a man called Carl Benjamin. Let's check his name's Carl. His name's Sargon of Akkad online. But his real name is Carl Benjamin. He lives in Swindon.
You can also tell this based on the fact that they're already laughing at his name before she even gets to where he's actually from. There is no generic home counties town one could inhabit that wouldn't make the stark contrast to the username Sargon of Akkad kind of funny. Believe me, I'm from a generic home counties town. I only bring up this random comment because it shows how Sargon and his fans are quite bad at understanding why a joke is supposed to be funny, or indeed inappropriate, and how context should inform interpretation of a joke, but I'm sure this is the last time this issue will come up. Anyway, so one day I was looking into the whole Count Dankula Nazi pug controversy, and I saw that Mr. Dankula himself, Mark Meechan, Sargon of Akkad and Paul Joseph Watson have joined UKIP as part of an attempted soft coup, and I thought, this could be mildly interesting. Flash forward a couple of months later, and I'm having to explain to my parents how a man who became famous because people were angry at women in video games is now being criticised by the media for comments he made about Labour MP for Birmingham Yardley, Jess Phillips. Specifically, and this is where I'll go ahead and drop a trigger warning for people who might be made uncomfortable by this discussion, it's about sexual assault. Benjamin said that he, quote, wouldn't even rape Jess Phillips.
People talking about raping me isn't fun, but has become somewhat par for the course. Well, I'll tell you what, Jess, I think that's terrible. And you know what? I wouldn't even rape you. I wouldn't even rape you. Not even.
This video is kind of a spiritual successor to a video I made many years ago about the amazing atheist, who has also previously been in hot water regarding his comments about rape and women in general. Except this time, rather than having just one coherent video by Sargon addressing these issues, there are various interviews all over the place where Sargon offers a variety of justifications for his comments. This is one of the reasons why this video has taken a while. I wanted to make sure I left no stone unturned, and that there wasn't some secret fantastic justification for these comments hidden somewhere. Interestingly, in almost every interview, Sargon claims that he's done many interviews on this subject, and that he's tired of answering the questions about it over and over. But there's really no clear interview that he's given where he does anything other than try to shift the focus away from his comments by insisting that he's answered objections about them before ad nauseum. So until that interview emerges, you're obviously going to have to keep getting asked about it. Anyway, on the subject of Sargon videos, he did make a response to Joe Brand titled Dear Joe Brand, and from the very first line, you know it's going to be a fantastic video.
I don't want to have to talk about George Orwell's novel 1984 all the time, but...
I mean, isn't that just the most neckbeard loser, rational skeptic, free speech activist thing you've ever seen? I really don't want to constantly compare me not being allowed to say shitty things on the internet with impunity to a dystopian future where meaningful freedoms are taken away from people, but Indeed, Sargon hates talking about Orwell so much that he couldn't help but bring it up in an interview with the BBC.
As Orwell says printed on the front of this building, if liberty is to mean anything at all, it must mean the right to tell people that which they don't want to hear.
Here's a neat trick for these right-wing free speech activists. Take what they say about free speech and just insert what they actually said and see how much less noble the quote becomes. If liberty is to mean anything, it must mean the right to tell Jess Phillips that you wouldn't even rape her. So inspiring. Because here's the thing, the argument isn't over whether Sargon has the right to say these things. The question is, should those things be considered damning on his morality because they're really shitty things to say? And you can't appeal to a quote that's from a man who's famous for writing stories about genuine tyrannies in order to justify the supposed virtue of you making inappropriate comments about whether you'd rape an MP. You're not the hero here. Also, I'm just going to say it, Orwell is wrong. Admittedly, I don't think he meant for his quote to be taken as literally as Sargon is taking it. He was almost certainly thinking about the noble acts of defiance in the face of tyranny when he made that remark, not just being obnoxious and saying shitty things. There are a lot of things people don't want to hear for very good reasons. Ignorant and hateful things. Because here's the thing. Your right to say whatever horrible thing you want is not the be-all and end-all of liberty. Case in point, in America, you can say whatever you want. In Germany, you can't deny the Holocaust. And in China, you cannot criticize the government. If being able to say whatever you want, even if people don't want to hear it, is the be-all and end-all of liberty, then Germany is closer to China than they are to America, in terms of how free they are. Yes, Germany, the Democratic Federal Republic, is equivalent to China, the one-party totalitarian state, because in Germany you can't deny that an industrial genocide took place by the government. And the people of Germany are just as oppressed as the people of China, because the people of Germany can't deny that an industrial genocide took place, while the people of China can't look at any content critical of their government. To call Germany a tyranny or to even begin to compare it to China would be ridiculous. And I'm not even saying I agree with Germany's laws regarding free speech. I'm simply saying that limitations to free speech don't mean that a society is unfree. There are greater freedoms out there than the freedom to make nasty remarks about whether you'd rape somebody. But he doesn't stop there. He then starts comparing the reports about him to the 2-minute hate.
In 1984, the 2 Minutes Hate was a daily public period where members of the outer party, so not the top brass who are controlling things, but those who are orbiting around in the middle, used to attack those who are outside of the party, the enemies of the party. Anyone who could be a threat to the current status quo is anathematized, and those on the inside are told to just hate them.
The first thing to pick up on here is that Sargon is clearly overestimating how much people care about him. He's been brought up maybe 3 times on Have I Got News For You, and all of those times it's either been part of the roundup section where they go through some of the smaller stories in the news, or as a small part of a larger story. Most people could easily watch one of the Have I Got News For You episodes he's mentioned in and come out of the other end of it not even having remembered his name. In fact, he maybe just manages to clock in about 2 minutes of attention in total. And apart from that, you have his interviews, which aren't comparable to the 2 minutes of hate at all, since he's able to defend himself. Also, most people don't even hate Sargon in the strictest sense, because they don't view him as important in himself. He's symptomatic of a larger problem in the populist right, represented in that they now have a candidate who has made jokes about raping a female MP. It's not, oh no, Carl Benjamin is so awful, whatever shall we do? But rather, oh no, look at how awful the far right is. They've now got a potential MEP who made jokes about raping a female MP. And to the extent people do actually care enough to hate him, it's not because he's on the outskirts of the mainstream political class, it's because he's a prick. You can't act like an arsehole and then use the fact people hate you to bolster your persecution narrative. Well, you can, because loads of right-wingers do that, but you shouldn't. Also, as I pointed out in my comments on the Shapiro BBC interview, the British press is notorious for taking the worst things they can find about somebody and holding them to account for it. The only reason why Sargon is special is because he's said some things which are significantly worse than what your standard image-conscious politician would say. So if anything, Sargon has been treated better than the average politician, since the average politician would have to spend a great deal longer having to account for comments that were much more innocuous. Finally, I hope I've already made clear my disdain for referencing Orwell. Orwell. I've no problem with Orwell himself, but references to him are so overused that it's become the new version of calling somebody a Nazi. Having said all of this, I've occasionally seen left tubers make reference to the 2 minutes of hate to describe the way that reactionary YouTubers dogpile on SJWs. And it's very appropriate, because some SJW makes a relatively harmless remark, and the entire reactionary sphere swarms around them like piranhas. And ultimately, these SJWs didn't do much wrong. In the case of Sarkeesian, for example, she said that video games contain sexist tropes. For that, she got something closer to 2 years of hate. If we're talking about irrationally attacking relatively harmless people as one collective hindmind, that describes 99% of response videos to SJWs on YouTube. Now, like I say, I don't think it's advisable to reference 1984 because it's so overdone now, but when it is done, there are some comparisons that are less ridiculous than others. Anyway, I actually want to take a moment to defend Sargon. See, Sargon was taken out of context by Joe Brand, or rather, the Have I Got News For You writers.
Euro candidate Carl Benjamin might have committed a crime when he stated he might rape Labour MP Jess Phillips.
The way that she relays his comment makes it sound like he's threatening to rape Jess Phillips. If I said I might blow up a synagogue, that carries with it a clear implication. But if we look at what Sargon said in context, which is a clip I actually struggled to find, so sorry for the quality, but...
There's been an awful lot of talk about whether I would or would not even rape Jess Phillips. I've been in a lot of trouble for my hardline stance of not even raping her. I suppose with enough pressure I might cave. But let's be honest, nobody's got that much beer. I have to say I had a really great time at Bristol.
Now, before I explain that Sargon was taken out of context, I do just want to explain that simply because something qualifies as a joke, that doesn't make it acceptable. So my point here is only that his comment is a joke, not that it was an appropriate joke to make. But it clearly is a joke, and like most jokes, it forms a basic logical syllogism via a faulty conclusion. Premise 1, Sargon said he wouldn't rape Jess Phillips. Premise 2, people got really angry about this comment, faulty conclusion, therefore people would stop being angry if he said he would rape Jess Phillips. So that's the joke, and to report this as Carl Benjamin said he might rape Jess Phillips is taking it out of context. Now this for me is interesting because Sargon spends a lot of time talking about how he's been taken out of context.
As your
But
record.
you've taken that out of the context that it was put in, so people don't know why that was done. And that's why I'm not going to answer these questions, because I'm not going to have things taken out of context from years ago when people could just go back and watch it and see the context. I mean, like, I'm not doing that without a reason.
Well,
but
actually,
like I said, it's all difficult to explain out of the context. It's all heavily laden in irony. There's a meta point.
Now here's the thing about the word context. Very often it's used as a way to avoid having to explain something, which is the exact opposite of how the word should be used. If you're ever going to mention the word context, you should be prepared to explain what the context was. But when Sargon talks about the context, the only explaining he does is by continuing to labour the point that he shouldn't have to explain anything because context. This is basically the same type of bad exegesis you get if you've ever looked into comparative religious studies. You ask somebody about a piece of scripture and they say, oh, you're taking it out of context. So you get all excited, ready to have your understanding of scripture expanded by having the context added, only to find out that the person doesn't have anything else to say. The word context was the extent of their defense. Saying something was taken out of context isn't bad in itself. Often the claim that something has been taken out of context is followed by a very enlightening explanation of what the actual context is and how that changes the meaning. The problem is, Sargon doesn't explain how these remarks were taken out of context, which means that the claim that they were is harder to take seriously. And in my mind, this issue is compounded by the fact that sometimes Sargon clearly is taken out of context.
In another section of the video, Mr. Benjamin uses racial slurs.
So, off chink, it's okay for me to call you this because racism is power plus prejudice.
Undoubtedly, some comments by Sargon could easily be explained with context, but he doesn't. Why doesn't he? He talks about how things were taken out of context while never explaining the original context. I honestly think the reason is tactical. He knows that if he explains the context for the cases where he really is taken out of context, then that would set a precedent that he would have to explain why all the remarks are taken out of context, which is an issue when the greatest offending remark, that he wouldn't even rape Jess Phillips, is not taken out of context. It's just a horrible thing he chose to say about, and directed at, an MP. So by refusing to explain any of it, Sargon avoids the expectation that he should explain all of it, and therefore he can just say, context, 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 it's fine in the original context, and idiots will think that he's made some kind of defense. Slight tangent, but I want to look at Sargon's comments on a remark made by Joe Brand. For context, Joe Brand jokingly said something to the effect of, it's a shame that people are only throwing milkshake at far-right activists when battery acid exists. Now obviously Joe Brand wasn't seriously calling for acid attacks, but given that acid attacks have been a growing concern in recent years, this was a rather irresponsible joke. An acid attack on a politician is not totally beyond the pale, and obviously acid attacks are particularly horrendous. This is all true, but Sargon is still able to take the situation and show how he is unable to understand the nature of jokes.
If it's okay for Joe Brand, why is it not okay for me?
Okay, so this is an argument that right-wingers love to make. I'm pretty sure it all goes back to that notoriously stupid South Park claim, either it's all okay, or none of it is, which is to say, if you think that absolutely anything somebody could say is so morally unacceptable that it should be made illegal or censored from television or simply shunned by mainstream society, then literally no speech anywhere ever is okay. But in general, no. You can't just say, well, if they can do it, why can't I, when they did something different to you? Now, I'm not going to really attempt to explain why what Joe Brand said was less offensive than what Sargon said, mostly because I think it can't easily be shown whether one joke is worse than the other. But don't worry, Sargon has a fantastic method.
Your statement is way worse than my statement. Do you know how I know this? In Britain, acid attackers will get a life sentence even if they miss their targets, according to Crown prosecution guidelines. Rapists do not receive this level of punishment, Joe. Qualitatively, what you have done is worse than what I have done, which is joking about acid attacks compared to joking about rape.
I mean, what a stupid fucking argument. The offensiveness of a joke isn't determined by how much time in prison the topic of your joke would get you. By this logic, the most offensive jokes would all be about murder, but that's not how it works. What needs to be taken into account is whether the joke was called for, whether there was malicious intent behind the joke, and whether the joke unfairly targets a particular demographic. At least in the first and last case, Sargon's joke was more offensive. But also, by Sargon's logic, a racist or sexist joke that has nothing to do with any crime would apparently be considered absolutely fine. Now, I wouldn't think this needs to be explained, but if an MP was walking around telling racist and sexist jokes, even jokes that didn't reference any illegal activities, that would still get them in a lot of trouble. So when Sargon isn't using faulty logic to justify himself, he's just outright denying reality.
You were, when asked about Gerard's handling of the rape tweet, you said honestly...
Sorry. What tweet?
The tweet, a question about rape of a Labour politician.
There was no question about rape. That's a lie, and I'm not going to accept that framing. No, I'm not accepting that framing.
Okay, you tell me how I should.
I wouldn't either. That's not correct.
He thinks it's unacceptable to call it a rape tweet, even though it was a tweet about rape. Indeed, it was a tweet about raping an MP. Yes, the tweet did declare that Sargon wouldn't rape Jess Phillips, but, well, I hope I didn't need to explain this, but talking about whether you would or would not rape anybody is wildly inappropriate no matter which side you come down on, because normal human beings understand that sometimes a statement, while true, may be inappropriate. It's inappropriate to even bring up the notion of whether you'd rape somebody. Obviously. And this is ignoring the fact that he said he wouldn't even rape her, as if he found her in some way too disgusting to rape or not worthy of being raped. So yes, framing this tweet as a rape tweet is perfectly acceptable phrasing and not a lie. Now I'm going to continue to look at Sargon's other defences for his remarks, aside from just saying they were taken out of context. Before we begin, I just want to point out that UKIP leader Gerard Batten actually admitted that Sargon's comments were inappropriate.
He has made an ill-considered remark.
This would have been a good way for Sargon to handle the situation as well, by admitting that he was wrong. Instead, he said this.
Honestly, if I were Gerard Batten, I'd been like, well, I wouldn't even either.
Way to go. The leader of the party you belong to tried to vouch for you, and you fucked him.
Seriously though, I'm going to get in so much trouble.
In fact, really this should be used to hold Batten's head to the flames, because he's admitted that the remarks were inappropriate and defended it by saying it's not okay to bring up comments from a long time ago. But now Sargon has come out and basically doubled down on his position with these remarks. So what's Gerard gonna do? Of course nothing, because the original comment about what Sargon said being inappropriate was an insincere remark just designed to avoid the issue. Anyway, Sargon actually does, believe it or not, in this very same clip, try to justify his remarks with the oldest trick in the books.
I think he handled it well. I mean, it was a form of satire, you know.
Ah, yes, the satire defence, and elsewhere.
I said lots of things in the past that are jokes, are satire, are irony-laden, and honestly, I don't think you are keyed into internet culture enough to really understand it.
Right, just one small question. Satire of what? Because the satire defense is just like the context defense. It doesn't do away with the need for an explanation, but rather compounds it. What were you satirizing? I sort of wish I had more to say here, but there's so little to work with when he just makes a completely unsubstantiated claim. Satire is when you adopt a position in order to mock it. But what position is Sargon adopting and how is he mocking it? If he had made a sarcastic remark from the perspective of Phillips, that would be satire. This inappropriate joke isn't. But apparently, I'm just a big baby.
There are people who are deeply offended by some of the things that you've said.
Well, I tell you what, they can go and have a cry, and when they've collected themselves and they're ready to talk like an adult about the issues and not bring up things that they think might be offensive and spread them around the country to people who might be offended by them, then we can have a sensible conversation about the issue.
Okay, so there's a bit to unpack here. Firstly, the implication is that you can't be offended and collected at the same time. You can't say, that was a really fucking awful thing you just said, and I think you should face social and political ramifications for that remark without being a crybaby. Clearly this isn't true. And as for discussing the issue, even after some hypothetical cry, the issue is still going to be the shitty things you said. I mean, just think about this. Apparently, talking about the hurtful things that somebody has said is not an adult thing to do. So notoriously, it's always adults walking around calling each other poo-poo heads, and it's always those immature crybabies saying things like, I don't think you should unnecessarily hurt people's feelings. It's not a polite way to interact with each other, and people aren't going to want to associate with you if you say those things, because there's nothing more adult than making horrible, unfunny, and unintelligent jokes about somebody that will achieve nothing other than upsetting them. Elsewhere, and in a considerably worse recording actually recorded by Sargon himself, we have this comment.
So making those comments is okay?
Yes, if they're jokes. You can make jokes about anything. Ask someone like Frankie Boyle or David Baddiel. They've long, and Ricky Gervais. These people have long defended making offensive jokes. It's a long-standing British tradition. I can't even believe you would ask me if it's okay to joke about dark things. Yes, of course it is.
First of all, I like how you can hear Sargon say yes under his breath. As if he's just cheering on what a fantastic point he has made. The same point is actually made by UKIP guy, I don't know what position he hold to, but he said a similar thing.
He mentions Frankie Boyle. I find Frankie Boyle particularly distasteful. But he has been given his own show on BBC Two. He is funded by the taxpayer, the licensed taxpayer.
This is the most wild whatabouter I've ever heard.
Carl Benjamin has said that he is an entertainer.
I mean, think about this for a second. Most of what we're talking about when we're talking about offensive jokes by these people is simply crude humour. And yes, many people find that offensive and distasteful, but it's in no way related to comments made about somebody else centred on whether you would or would not rape that person. And the little smile this guy gives as if he thinks he's made this really good point here. It just shows that these guys don't know how to make good points or understand how context changes things. There is nothing hypocritical about supporting comedians who make crude jokes that don't directly attack people, or indeed, jokes that are intelligently constructed to shock people and to get them to think about important issues. Sargon's remarks did not do this. Now, there have been offensive comments made about people by various comedians. However, in this case, either the remarks have clearly not come from a place of hatred, but simply from wanting to shock the audience, or else if the comments have come from hatred, then that hatred has been proportional to something bad that the person being hated on has done. Also, most of these jokes don't have, as it were, collateral damage. For example, take a joke about the fact that Barack Obama was the first Nobel Peace Prize winner to bomb another Nobel Peace Prize winner. That's a funny joke that points to the fact that Obama was, at least in one major way, a really shitty person, and that his winning of a Nobel Peace Prize was embarrassingly premature. But calling Obama the N-word would not be appropriate, because that would be indirectly attacking not just Obama, but all black people by using a racial slur against all black people to attack Obama. Likewise, when Sargon uses rape to attack Jess Phillips, firstly, it's in no way proportional to anything Jess Phillips has done that is worthy of such hatred, but also, such a remark is offensive to many women for whom the threat of rape is a serious issue. Like, if I were to make a remark about raping even the most horrible woman in the world, that would still be wildly inappropriate, because I'm using something which many men have done to women, and something which many women are incredibly sensitive about, in order to attack one particular woman. So no, there is no equivalent between Sargon saying,
people talking about raping me isn't fun, but has become somewhat par for the course. Well, I'll tell you what, Jess, I think that's terrible. And you know what? I wouldn't even rape you. I wouldn't even rape you. Not even.
And any of the offensive stuff that various comedians have said, like if tomorrow Frankie Boyle tweeted about raping Theresa May, do you think that would go down well? No, it would be career-ending for him. But that doesn't happen because Frankie Boyle is a serious comedian who understands the difference between actual comedy and being a genuinely shitty human being. But Sargon is here to inform us that anything can be joked about. which wasn't even the main point in contention. The question is whether his comments directed specifically at a female MP related to rape were inappropriate, not can rape be joked about. But either way, strap in, because Sargon is here to lay down the facts.
That's the reason we have jokes, is to remove the horror from a particularly negative thing. That's why British troops survived so well in the trenches in World War I and II. They were famous for their dark humour, to help them cope with life and cope with the terrible things that happened.
They were joking about something awful that was going on around them. You've conjured up the notion of raping a woman, a named woman.
Now, rather than overcoming my NPC programming to react to this, I'm just going to play somebody else reacting to it.
That's why British troops survived so well in the trenches in World War I and II. They were famous for their dark humour, to help them cope with life and cope with the terrible things that happened.
Pause it for 1 second. So, Sargon of Akkad is arguing that the reason why he was joking about why he wouldn't even rape this MP had to do with the horrible situation that I guess we're all in. Who's in the horrible situation that he's making these jokes to make it easier?
It was like in World War I when both sides came together in no man's land and started telling rape jokes.
You remember all of those? Remember that was what Dunkirk was like, watching a dice routine.
Okay, so that clip sort of points out the ridiculousness of this argument already. Yes, humour about dark things, also known as gallows humour, is a good way to cope with being in a shitty situation. However, there is no shitty situation that Sargon's remarks were helping anybody to cope with. Or so you'd think, but Sargon is actually going to argue that his comments are okay because they're empowering two rape victims.
And I spoke to a victim of rape very recently, and in one of the street interviews that I've been doing, she thanked me for being able to take the power back from such a terrible experience. By owning it herself and being able to make jokes about the subject, it doesn't control her.
Now, again, I think it's probably true that victims of rape can get humour out of their situations and use humour to cope. I'm not of the position that it's 100% always wrong to say a joke about rape can be funny. Because you know what? Maybe there are some rape survivors who have had gallows humour about their own situation. I will admit I've never actually heard a joke about rape I personally consider to be funny. And that isn't me virtue signalling. I just think that the voices of rape survivors are not prominent in our, rape culture, so we don't get to hear too many good jokes from the perspective of survivors. I suppose that people making fun of Sargon for his shitty comments about rape is a good example of humour being used to overcome trauma. Like if somebody was bothered by Sargon being a shitty human being and found that it made them angry, they could use Joe Brown's comments to cope through humour. So there we go, an example of using humour to cope with the trauma of rape. But let's just remind ourselves that Sargon said he wouldn't even rape Jess Phillips. There is no way that anybody seriously finds that empowering as a rape survivor. Like there are probably some comments from comedians that have been made about rape that would offend some rape survivors, while others would be able to laugh at it and feel empowered by them. However, there isn't a single person on the planet who genuinely heard Sargon say that he wouldn't even rape Jess Phillips and thought to themselves, yep, that humour is helping me to cope with my own trauma of rape. I don't care what Sargon says. It's sort of equivalent to alt-right humour being justified based on the gallows humour that many Jews have about the Holocaust and their history of persecution. But even if there genuinely is some rape survivor out there who is genuinely empowered by Sargon's remarks, Sargon acts as if this in some way negates the experiences of those who responded negatively to his comment.
Let me read you what survivors have told us. These are
there is no one narrative here.
Are you interested in hearing what they've said?
No, because you're not interested in hearing what they say to me. And from a mid-20s female survivor, she thanked me for making jokes like this.
How do you respond to that?
Here's the thing. There will always be crazy people. There will always be gay people who don't support gay marriage. There will always be women who don't support the right to vote. But to take these outliers and say that there is no one narrative here is dishonest. A handful of people who said they didn't have a problem with Sargon's remarks or actively supported them has no bearing on the vast majority of people who would be offended by them. It's genuinely like saying that you don't support gay people being allowed to get married because some gay people said they don't want to, and then saying that there's no one narrative on gay rights. Technically this is all true, but it misses the point that one side is much more prominent and also makes much more sense. It makes sense that rape survivors are offended and upset by Sargon's comments. It doesn't make sense that rape survivors would feel empowered by his comments. So clearly those people are just crazy and not worth being seriously considered as relevant to the discussion. And none of this changes the fact that most people can say they've not publicly made inappropriate comments about whether they'd rape an MP, thus causing rape victims all over the country to feel upset at their remarks, while Sargon cannot make that claim. Also, again, if Sargon could defend what he was saying, he'd defend what he was saying. But instead, he can only say that there are some people who agree with him. I just need to reiterate how stupid this is. There are times when you can defend inappropriate jokes by saying they can help people to cope with bad situations. When you've just used the fact you wouldn't rape somebody as a means to insult them is up there as one of the worst times to attempt that argument. So that's Sargon's first 3 defenses out of 6. Let's review. He says he was taken out of context, which is true for some of the things he said, but the main comment that everybody has an issue with was seemingly not taken out of context, and Sargon hasn't explained the context. He says that his remarks were satire of what exactly, it's not clear, and he says that his comments were jokes, and that joking is an empowering way of coping with bad situations, and I hope I've made clear my opinions on that argument. So entering the next half of justifications, and we have to claim that what Sargon did was necessary in order to bring attention to the issues he considers to be important.
So I have to say interesting things in an entertaining way that gets people thinking. And the people I need to talk to are people who simply refuse to listen. And I knew that this would be a moral offence, but not a legal offence, that they wouldn't be able to refuse. They would have to acknowledge that I existed.
Okay, so you might be thinking, it seems to me like if you want to draw attention to your opinions, the best thing to do would be to not make a comment so offensive that it's going to dog you throughout your campaign. And guess what? Sargon agrees with you, because he says this in the very same interview.
Instead of talking about the very well thought out positions that I have, they are instead very interested in, for some reason, defending the sanctity of Jess Phillips and feminism.
So Sargon made these offensive comments in order to get people's attention so that he could talk about the important issues he wants to talk about. However, now he's surprised that instead of wanting to talk about all the things that he wants to talk about, the only attention he has got has been regarding his rape tweet. Indeed, Sargon probably would have got more attention by not being grossly offensive, and instead simply by being the first YouTuber to join a somewhat mainstream political party. And this leads on to a fundamental point, a point I probably should have ended on, but I already went to the effort of organising all the interview clips and coming up with good segues from one point to the other, so I just don't feel like reorganising things. Sargon is shit at doing the one thing he wants to do. See, Sargon's goal is to draw attention to free speech, and he actually seems to want to turn UKIP into the free speech party, not the Brexit party, not the anti-immigration party, not the Conservative party. If we follow his logic, this is why he says the things he does, to get people's attention and get an opportunity to preach his platform. He wants the party to primarily be the free speech party that would presumably serve to bring about an American-style First Amendment.
Honestly, for me, I'm not going to speak for UKIP as a whole, but for me, being able to table these issues around free speech is the most important thing. I'm a free speech activist.
That's a fine goal, and I don't have an issue with it. However, as with Sargon's quoting of Orwell, we see how the force of the conviction is somewhat robbed by the specific things we would expect Sargon to say. The reason why people in the UK don't really care about free speech is because most cases of free speech being limited that I'm aware of basically amount to some chav calling somebody the N-word on Twitter and getting a visit from the police for it. It's not exactly vulcanizing stuff to intelligent, idealistic people who want to stand for liberty and justice. However, what's annoying is that there are genuine free speech issues. 2 in particular that come to mind and genuinely concern me. The first, and less relevant, would be the criminalisation of criticising Islam. I'm not talking about some EDL member getting a visit from the police for calling Muslims racial slurs. I'm talking about the European Court of Human Rights ruling that it's permissible to convict somebody for blasphemy laws if they call Muhammad a paedophile. As The Guardian reports, in 2009 an Austrian woman known as ES held seminars on Islam in which she likened Muhammad's marriage to a 6-year-old Aisha to paedophilia. She was convicted of disparaging religion in keeping with a history of supporting blasphemy laws. The European Court of Human Rights upheld the conviction. ES's comments, it ruled, aimed at demonstrating that Muhammad was not a worthy subject of worship. Presenting objects of religious worship in a provocative way capable of hurting the feelings of believers, it added, could be conceived as malicious violation of the spirit of tolerance. The obvious next question becomes, if it's not okay to call Muhammad a paedophile, is it okay to call him a murderer, a torturer, a sex addict, an adulterer, a thief, a con man? Because Muhammad was all of those things. Please note how the justification for the conviction was that it attempted to show Muhammad was not a worthy subject of worship. If that's enough to get somebody arrested, then we're in trouble because Muhammad was not a worthy subject of worship, he was a twat. This is a genuine free speech issue. Oh, and while I'm here, this is a good time to bring up the fact that I'm planning on moving my religious videos to a new channel, which I'll link in the description. But on that channel, I will criticize Islam plenty. So there is a genuine chance I could fall afoul of laws like this. Now, I don't think it's likely that will happen, but it's a possibility. And if it does, then Sargon claiming that his remarks about whether he'd rape an MP should be immune to scrutiny is not going to help me one bit. What will help me is intelligent and respectable people coming forward and pointing out that criticizing ideas is not hate speech. Criticizing a man who's been dead for 1400 years and may not have even existed in the first place is not hate speech. that criticising a theology and a holy book and a religious leader are all freedoms that are fundamental to a free society, even while the freedom to harass MPs with comments about rape is not. Now, with that in mind, it's worth moving into the second major free speech issue, and that is the attack on feminists who are skeptical of the claim that somebody with a penis can decide they're a woman. Indeed, they believe, as is entirely reasonable, that your sex determines your gender, and therefore they might call biological males by masculine pronouns regardless of how these biological males identify. This could get them done for hate speech. Indeed, even a trans woman was recently taken to court for transphobic remarks for upholding a gender-critical viewpoint. Now, I bring this up not only because I could fall afoul of these laws, but because Jess Phillips could do as well. See, she recently tweeted, "I find these demands completely reasonable. I know that we can have a solution and a reasonable adjustment and a rhetoric that gives progress to trans people and protects women-only spaces." Now, that might sound a little gender critical to you. Trans people deserve to be loved and respected and tolerated and not treated as second-class citizens, but trans people are not women, and women-only spaces need to be protected from trans people. That's the clear subtext for this tweet, and this hasn't been missed by many of the usual suspects who like to shout transphobe at people who are standing up for the protection of trans rights and progress for trans people. Now, is there a possibility that Jess Phillips may have just worded this improperly and does actually believe that trans women are women? Yes, there is. Is there a possibility that she'll capitulate to the mob and declare that of course women's only spaces need to accommodate trans women as well? Yes, there is. However, there is also a possibility that the wording of this tweet was very deliberate to communicate that a woman is an adult human female and not an identity felt by somebody with a penis. In this case, Phillips herself could be having to champion free speech against the prosecutors who want to silence women. So, we have two legitimate free speech issues here. We can't be honest about what the sources clearly teach about Muhammad, and we can't be honest about what a woman is. We have to be silent on these issues in some circumstances, and there is going to be a time when genuine, sensible progressives are going to have to come together in solidarity to protect free speech, or else risk being silenced for good. But here's the thing. It's not despite this, but rather because of this, that I have so little patience for Sargon's free speech-oriented political campaign. Because he's making free speech look like it's just for shitty people who don't like that decent people don't want to hear all the shitty things they have to say. And that's because largely in the West, that is what a lot of this free speech anxiety is about. This actually drowns out the genuine issues where there are real meaningful debates being constrained because the question isn't over whether we can accurately report what the sources tell us about a religious figure or whether we can stand true to the definition of woman that was fought for by women throughout centuries of struggle for liberation, but instead over whether it's appropriate to say you wouldn't even rape Jess Phillips. So there we go. Sargon reckons that he's a free speech activist who needed to say these offensive remarks to get everybody's attention. In doing so, he has damaged the fight for free speech by just being another prick looking to escape the consequences of the shitty things he said. And people who really care about free speech on important issues lose some legitimacy. Now next we have Sargon's best defense yet, and I'm just going to let the clip speak for itself.
I think we should treat women the same as men. And that means if a woman is being a giant bitch, I'm going to be a giant dick back to her. Any questions?
So apparently Jess Phillips was a giant bitch. She's also a radical feminist, according to Sargon.
For example, Jess Phillips is a radical feminist, and she's just not interested in having a discussion on the fact that suicide is the #1 killer for men under 45.
Now, it might actually be true that Phillips is a radical feminist. I mean, she certainly seems to be gender critical, but obviously Sargon is using the phrase radical feminist incorrectly here regardless, because he's not talking about Phillips' stance on trans identity politics when he calls her a radical feminist. He's defining a radical feminist as a feminist who doesn't care about men's issues. This is not the definition of a radical feminist. But this does lead on to the justification Sargon gives for calling Phillips a giant bitch, because apparently she laughed at male suicide.
And that means if a woman is being a giant and laughing at male suicide, I'm going to be a giant back to her. Any questions?
Now, I do just want to point out that even if this was true, it wouldn't justify Sargon's comments about raping her, since joking about raping somebody is, well, it's basically never justified. Like, people joked about pissing on Thatcher's grave, but people didn't joke about raping her, because rape is fucking horrible. Heck, most people, most progressives certainly, are in agreement that it's even wrong to joke about really bad men being raped in prison. But if Sargon had actually just called Phillips a bitch, even a giant bitch, then that might have been somewhat excusable, if he is right about her laughing at male suicide. Now, I personally consider bitch to be a gendered slur, so therefore I would say the term is inappropriate, similar to how it would be wrong to call a particularly unsavoury gay person a faggot. Since it's a slur, it's inadvertently targeting all of that particular demographic. However, since not everyone is on board with the claim that bitch is a gendered slur, we'll allow for the possibility that Sargon would just be using it to refer to this particular woman. And if that was the case, then I think whether he should be called out for those remarks should depend on whether his characterization of Jess Phillips is accurate. For example, I have called Sargon a prick, and that's because of the comments he has made, not least the comments he has made about raping Jess Phillips. So if somebody were to challenge me on this point, they should challenge whether I'm characterizing Sargon correctly, not whether I'm right or wrong to use this word. I bring this up to show that even if Sargon isn't right about Jess Phillips being a giant bitch, that doesn't excuse his comments about raping her. And with that in mind, let's see what happened.
Men, so the opportunity for men to raise issues that are important to them is very limited. And just to give you a flavour, Mr. Chairman, of the type of things that may come up and which will be part of international...
You have to excuse me for laughing, that the idea that men don't have the opportunity to ask questions in this place is a frankly laughable thing, as I say, as the only woman on this committee.
So as you can see, Philip Davis says that the opportunity for men to bring up issues that are important to them is very limited. Then Jess Phillips audibly laughs. Then I cut the video and we see Phillips explaining why she laughed. In that cut, which I simply cut for time, between her laughing and her explaining why she was laughing, was the comment about male suicide. So no, she didn't laugh at male suicide. That is an outright lie. I'll leave a link to the full video below. But also, what if I told you that Sargon, who is all self-righteous about Phillips laughing at male suicide, laughed at rape? And not just as a joke, but when it is being brought up in a serious context almost identical to the context Phillips was in.
In the morning, you wake up with a foul taste in your mouth, and also realize that you have dried semen on your lips and face. When you tell this to your friend, he informs you that after you passed out last night, he put his penis in your mouth and used it to get off.
Now, in this video, I think the reason why Sargon laughed is because he found the emotionally charged scenario ridiculous. I don't think he was genuinely laughing at oral rape itself, but laughing at it being brought up in this debate. Now, do I think Sargon is wrong to laugh here? Yes. The point that Winters is making here is that oral rape is not considered a crime in some US states. This is a legitimate issue and not something that should be laughed at. But if I were being charitable, I would say even here, he isn't laughing at oral rape. Nevertheless, by his own standards, if Jess Phillips is a giant bitch for managing to laugh about male suicide before male suicide has even been mentioned, then Sargon is an astronomical prick for laughing at oral rape after it has literally just been mentioned and in direct response to it being mentioned. So Sargon is a massive hypocrite and a liar for attacking Jess Phillips for laughing at male suicide, and this was his go-to justification for why he made these comments. Now, later on, he has gone on to point out that Jess Phillips is opposed to Davis's suggestion.
Yeah, but that's her feminist bias. She blocked it. That's why it wasn't talked about.
The implication here being that she's against tackling male suicide. Of course she isn't, but she's reluctant to legitimize these insincere attempts to push for men's gender equality issues as if there is some equivalent between the two sexes in this regard. Indeed, anti-feminists spend a lot of time bringing up male suicide to counter women fighting for their issues. They don't spend a fraction of that time actually fighting to prevent male suicide. And of course, Philip Davis has a very poor record when it comes to voting for equality when you look at his page on theyworkforyou.com, where he has voted consistently against gay rights and consistently against equality and human rights. For some reason they don't have a section for gender-orientated equality legislation, but based on how Davis has voted when it comes to equality regarding sexuality, it's hard to take him seriously as a true campaigner for men's equality. Now the real question is, if somebody like me was in a position of political power and suggested a parliamentary discussion on men's suicide on International Men's Day, would Phillips have taken the suggestion more seriously? I suspect the answer is yes, although we couldn't know for certain until we've seen how Phillips would respond to male suicide being raised as an issue by somebody who isn't actually sincere in bringing up male issues, because they're genuinely fighting for equality and not just bringing up male issues in order to undermine feminism. So Sargon was lying when he said that she laughed at male suicide. He was also lying by claiming that she wants to block looking into male suicide, since she was only opposed to Phillips's suggestion of discussing the issue, presumably because she suspects his motives are insincere and basically just concern trolling. This is a totally reasonable thing to assume, and just in case you were interested, Jess Phillips has consistently voted for equality and human rights. Therefore, Sargon must claim that the real reason Phillips deserves his ire is because she wants to control the internet.
She was parading around saying, look, I think I get all these rape threats and therefore I want to control the internet. And she's an MP, so it's not like she's powerless, right? And I said, right, look, the point I was making is regardless of what she says, she's going to do it anyway.
Now, I don't know exactly to what extent Phillips wants to control the internet. I've not seen Sargon expand upon this topic, but right off the bat, it's a pretty lame reason to be making offensive comments about whether you'd rape her. Like, I've already said, even if she laughed at male suicide, those comments would be inappropriate. And now we're down to, she wants there to be some sort of regulations about the internet. I'm going to guess regulations against harassment. That's not really a good reason to do something so hateful to her. And also, it has to be pointed out how counterproductive this is. I know reactionaries love shooting themselves in the foot, but I would think even they'd be smart enough to realise that a prominent political internet personality turned politician making a horrible, inappropriate comment about raping an MP would be a strong catalyst for pushing forward measures to curb online harassment and hate speech. So even if we accept the absurd logic that somebody just wanting to stop people sending them rape threats online is a justified reason to hate somebody so much that you would make comments about whether you'd rape them yourselves, well, it would still be ridiculously ineffective to do so. So it's hard to take that seriously as a reason for your actions. Now, the final point Sargon brings up is that he wasn't punching down. Well, he brings up some other stupid stuff too, which is kind of related. He says this, for example.
Why you think it is acceptable to say on Twitter that you wouldn't even rape a female Labour MP?
Because I don't think women are any different to men in the way that we should treat them. Unlike the establishment, unlike our judges who literally say if you were a man, I would have sent you to jail, I think we should treat women the same as men.
You know how right-wingers accuse the left of virtue signaling? Well, whatever you make of that accusation, at least it's true to say that the left does project certain virtues, like caring about the poor and underprivileged minorities and protecting the environment. Meanwhile, the right will make jokes about raping somebody and then defend it by saying that they're champions of free speech in an Orwellian nightmare, or a true believer in equality who treats women the same as men. Even though I've already clarified that it would be wrong to make these comments to a man, and pretty much every progressive I know would agree with me on this issue. By the way, this remark is actually the context for his claim that Phillips was being a giant bitch. I also think it's true that sometimes our system treats women more leniently than men, as Sargon points out in his little rant, with judges giving women more lenient sentences. But I didn't think equality of reception of offensive comments about rape was an area where we should be striving for equality, apart from an equality of it just not happening to anyone. And also consider how ignorant Sargon appears here, by claiming that women need to be treated equally to men, so they should receive more inappropriate comments about rape online. You know, to even things up. And he says this:
how is this acceptable behaviour for an MEP candidate?
Well, I wasn't a prospective MEP when I did it.
Which is fine, except that he should then apologise and explain why what he did was wrong and why he did it. But anyway, the main point he makes is that he wasn't punching down.
I'm being treated as a YouTube activist who has now turned into a candidate for the European elections, is being treated as if I'm punching down at an elected MP. And honestly, look, just think about this, right? Who's punching down here? You know, who's punching up and who's punching down? Is it just some guy in his office in Swindon who's, you know, the one with all the institutional power here? Or is the MP for Birmingham Yardley, who is running an insidious Orwellian campaign of censorship and preventing men's issues from being debated in Parliament, the one with the power here? They can't argue this point.
Now, these comments are strange mostly because the whole thing about punching down isn't some major thing outside of SJW circles. I'd understand if Sargon was making these points against SJWs who were criticising him, but he's just being criticised by mainstream society, who I don't think particularly care about collective notions of oppression and privilege and punching down. But here's the thing about punching down. It is a relevant factor. For example, a constituent saying shitty things to a politician is different to a politician saying shitty things to a constituent, because the MP has been given political power to represent the constituent fairly, and the constituent is well within their rights to be brutally honest in telling the MP that they've failed to do that. However, this punching up, punching down thing isn't the be-all and end-all. For example, a white person making lots of jokes about black people is going to be received more negatively than a black person telling jokes about white people, because the black person is punching up while the white person is punching down. But if the black person started saying some really offensive stuff about white people, then people would start to object. Punching up is not an immediate get-out-of-jail-free card, and comments about raping an MP go beyond the pale. Imagine a black comedian telling jokes about raping white people. The fact that they were punching up wouldn't save them. And finally, there is the fact that there is an intersection of oppression and privilege here. Yes, Phillips has a lot of political power, however online she can still be harassed by misogynists just the same as any other woman can. Honestly, I'd rather be me than Jess Phillips, because I don't have to look at horrible violent comments being directed at me.
It's a particular class of people, and they do share a particular kind of common culture, and I don't come from there. Well, who was raising the issues?
Comments they've made.
Who was raising those issues?
In what sense?
Who was raising those issues to those parties?
Well, they've been raised by a number of different campaign groups, by journalists, by other politicians,
but
by people.
Not by the regular people who are busy voting.
Well, they have been raised by people on Twitter and in internet forums, and actually that write into newspapers and contact journalists. So they have been raised by voters.
But again, we see Sargon virtue signalling by complaining that it's only the political class who are against him. This kind of brings us full circle, since we again have Sargon positioning himself as this great outsider who's being oppressed by the ruling Orwellian class. He really is that deluded. In his mind, he's on the right side of history, being unjustly silenced by the evil elite. In reality, he's some dickhead who attacked a woman online who didn't deserve it by making offensive comments about raping her. And suggesting that the average citizen doesn't object to these comments is not in keeping with my experience at all. Although I'm sure Sargon will point out that all my friends and family are mostly middle-class liberal types, but it's nonetheless not true to say that all my friends and family are part of some super privileged elite political class.
Which is why every single interview I've done has been about them trying to get me to agree to their moral framework. They say, well, don't you think, aren't you ashamed, aren't you? No, I don't agree. I don't actually follow a shame-based system of morality.
Basically, Sargon's issue is with people being held to account for the things they've done and said. That's presumably his definition of a shame-based morality system. I find this strange because I'd say that part of morality is that some things are moral and other things are immoral. In fact, he even admitted it was immoral earlier when he said it would be a moral offence but not a legal one. Well, if it was a moral offence, then he did something immoral, and yes, he should be shamed for that. See, reactionaries seem to object to the concept of morality itself. You can see Sargon discuss this here.
Jess Phillips went on a comedy programme in the UK called Have I Got News For You? And she literally declared that she had won the argument by saying that she's better than me.
Okay.
And I was just sat there like, oh my fucking God. Now we're back to 2017 with Anna Kaspari going, I'm fucking better than you. Yeah, I'm fucking better than you. Yeah, I'm fucking better than you.
You are garbage. Right?
Yeah. It's like, Jesus Christ, is that really her argument? I'm better than you. Is that your argument, is it, Jess?
Here's the thing. I loved Anna Kasparian for saying that, because it's true. If you voted for Donald Trump, I don't care why you did it, you're an awful human being. And morality does exist. If you live your life being a hateful human being and not a loving human being, then that's going to reflect really poorly on you. What annoys me is the demoralization of politics. Nope, not the demoralization, that means something else. The amoralization of politics, where if somebody kidnapped kids and put them in cages, we'd understand that was horrible. If somebody was actively racist to black people in their day-to-day life, most people would understand that was horrible. If somebody saw a rape occurring and did nothing, most people would understand that was horrible. However, if somebody votes for a party that puts children in cages, or causes massive racial injustices, or fails to update draconian rape laws and even expand them in some cases, then suddenly this becomes an issue that has nothing to do with morality. Honestly, I think we need to bring morality back into politics, and this is something which Sargon is really against. In another interview he rants about how much he hates the erosion of the distinction between the personal and the political.
Because the liberal state that we are all living in, the great gift it gave to the world is the separation between the public and private life.
Well, guess what? The personal affects the political, and the political affects the personal. If your politics is one that says you're willing to let people die from lack of basic necessities, then that is what your personality is as well. That is your morality. And honestly, I don't have a problem with people attacking my morality with reference to my politics. That's fine. I'm not saying only one side has to be on the receiving end here. I'm saying that most people actually agree on morality, it seems to me. But we have these huge political divides in this country, and one obvious solution would seem to be making morality a big part of the political discussion. A big part of that would be, when a shitty person gets elected, saying that the immoral candidate won because they were elected by immoral people. So yes, I heartily endorse Kasparian's claim that she's better than Trump voters. Now, as for Jess Phillips' statement that can be seen here,
other candidates of the milkshake attack trend include the UKIP MEP candidate, Carl Benjamin. You familiar with that gentleman, Jess?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the neckbeard that is Carl Benjamin. No, I don't think that you should throw things at politicians. I don't think that you should attack them. I think you should win by being better than them, which is what I am currently doing to Carl Benjamin.
She's not even talking about politics. She's talking about not making horrible comments about raping people. She's also making this comment that she's directly criticizing people for throwing milkshake at people they disagree with. So here she is condemning throwing milkshake at people based on political disagreement, while also, to my knowledge, having never made jokes about raping anybody, and she is saying that she's better than Carl Benjamin, because she is. Sargon's 3 attempts to show how she was a bad person were: 1, she laughed at male suicide, which she didn't. 2, she didn't support the attempt of a notorious anti-feminist to bring forward his perverted idea of gender equality that involves only caring about men's oppression when you can use it to undermine women's issues. 3, she wanted to stop people harassing her online. Meanwhile, well, we all know by this point what Sargon has done. But Sargon isn't going to take responsibility, so he says possibly the funniest remark, which I've saved until last.
Jess Phillips says it's harassment.
Yeah, but by
She
journalists.
told us you are harassing her.
By journalists.
She feels harassed by what you have said.
She didn't see anything that I said. It's journalists like you who put that in front of her face. You're the ones coercively controlling her by making sure she can't get away from it.
So it's not Sargon's fault for saying these horrible things. It's the fault of journalists for reporting on it. Imagine this logic in any other situation. You could say whatever shitty thing you like as a politician, and even when you get called out on it, say the journalists are more responsible because they're bringing the shitty things to other people's attention. Yes, that's the level of argumentation we're dealing with here. Anyway, this was a really long video. My throat hurts. I guess that's why it took so long. Not that my throat hurt. I added that as an aside. That isn't in the script. I was thinking after the first couple of days of watching Sargon of Akkad interviews in my spare time, this was going to take a while. So, not too much of an outro. Just like, comment, and subscribe. Next thing I'm planning on doing will be a series debunking Sargon's Why Does Everybody Hate Feminism series. One way you can ensure that the video I will make will be more frequent and perhaps more importantly, feature more research would be by donating some money on my Patreon. But if you can't afford that, just share the video and follow me on Twitter because any exposure helps. See you soon, hopefully. Woo! Thank you to my current patrons, Ben Name, Eric Hernandez, Finnegan Flan, Getting Off Podcast, Hannah Taylor, Kirsten, LRX89, Nancy D, Stephen, and Thz. You're all very appreciated.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!
Everybody's so mean. Is there like some type of course where all these right-wingers are going now, where they just basically, when you find yourself in an interview and people are actually just holding you to account for your positions or what you've stated, you make sure that you make this about some type of unfair malignment and unfair,
well, Andrew Neil should have been open about his membership in the DSA Libertarian Socialist Caucus and Momentum before he introduced